Well, hi everybody. I want to say I had a lovely drive. It was foggy and beautiful, and I'm not even tired. So, all right, I'm really excited to talk to you today. I know that we're going to talk about this topic, and we're also going to talk a little bit about having a personal brand. And part of the theme for me, it fit very well with the idea of personal brand, because part of my personal brand as a philosopher is that I want to pursue whatever is true. And I don't want to be pulled off of the track from what's true by tribalism, right? So I don't want to be distracted from something that's true because somebody from another ideological perspective is the one who's talking about it. And I don't want other people to be distracted from what's true because of something that's coming from the opposite view of their own. So that's kind of part of what I want to say today when we talk about personal brand. With regard to Black liberation in the marketplace, it's a very dear topic to my heart. I had two main reasons that I went into philosophy, and one of them was my experience with my two foster brothers, Matt and Tommy, both of whom are African-American young men, or were young men, they're grown now, and had a really hard time. They got caught up in the criminal justice system. I'm very interested in criminal justice reform, and I watched what they were going through. When I became a graduate student in political philosophy, we started reading people like John Rawls, who uses phrases like the least well-off, right? Who are the least well-off in our society? And when you think about things like educational outcomes, income, and involvement in the criminal justice system, the African-American male seems to be the least well-off group in the United States. And so I became sort of obsessed with this question of what happened, right? What happened? Why is this the case? What can we do about it? It was a huge motivation for me to study political philosophy and keeping my brothers, Matt and Tommy, in mind. Okay, so to hop in here, I'm going to show you something funny. Okay, it's a meme. Start with a funny meme. That's always a good way to start, right? All right, all I want for Christmas is the abolition of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy. Oh, that's a mouthful, isn't it? All right, so this would make a cute throw pillow for Christmas, right? Just kidding. So one of the groups that I want to talk to today are progressives, all right? So progressives might say something like this. They're worried about oppression. They think about history in terms of the history of oppression, and they're worried about all sorts of oppression, and I'm worried about oppression too. But one of the things that I want to challenge progressives on is whether capitalism should be in that list right there. I don't love the word capitalism. I'd rather use the term the open economy because people with very little capital can be quite successful in the marketplace. But that's another discussion for another day. Nevertheless, you know what I mean by capitalism, right? A market economy. And I actually want to say to progressives, you know, market economies can be extremely liberating. And part of the story I want to tell today is that some of the oppression that African Americans have historically experienced has actually been exclusion from the market economy and from the institutions that underlie the market economy. So instead of rejecting markets, I'm asking progressives to think about rejecting exclusion from markets and think more in terms of inclusion into markets, which can be very liberating for people. And I can give you a little evidence for that here. This is the global picture up to 2010, and the general direction has continued apace. Okay, so what you're seeing here is that starting in 1800, people are living on, you know, maybe $2 a day. This is true all over the globe. This is true everywhere you go. And as you get the spread of the institutions of private property, voluntary exchange, in the rise of markets, Deirdre McCloskey says you get a different kind of attitude towards entrepreneurs. You start to see entrepreneurs as kind of heroic, where before merchants were sort of questionable, right? Because they didn't fit in, neither nobility nor peasant, right? But now you start to see, hey, wait a second, merchants are really serving a great purpose for us. As those attitudes begin to change, you see a sudden shift, and this is very sudden, by the way. If I showed you this from, say, 1000 AD, the curve would go up very quickly. As a matter of fact, people call it the hockey stick because it looks like a hockey stick, right? Suddenly, in 1800, you get this explosion of wealth, okay? And this is from markets. This is from the rise of global markets. And we're now, in case you don't know, well, maybe I should ask you guys, how many of you think that global poverty is getting worse? Or thought that before you saw this chart? If the world is getting worse, I have a lot of friends who think the world is getting a lot worse. Do you think it's getting better, that global poverty is getting better, or are you just not sure? How many of you are not sure? Okay, now I'm seeing some hands go. All right, a lot of places I go, and I've spoken in prisons, I've spoken to Republican groups, I've spoken to Democrat groups, all different groups. Oftentimes when I ask them, what do you think is happening with global poverty? They say it's getting much worse, right? Because gosh, you open the news and everything looks pretty bad, right? The news isn't going to tell you any good news, they're only going to tell you bad news, okay? In fact, we are doing so much better, it's stunning. I mean, we should really almost faint when we hear this news because it's absolutely unheard of in the history of all of mankind. We are now to the point where abject poverty, which is measured by living under $2 a day, is almost completely gone. We're down to 10% of the population. The World Bank is considering getting rid of the category altogether. That's how much richer people are getting. Regular people, not just the very rich, right? Regular everyday people are getting rich fast. And by rich, I mean getting enough money to send their kids to school, right? And buy their kids antibiotics. Okay, this is what we mean, right? They're getting above that $2 a day level and starting to be able to pursue education, good health, and things like that. So it's really incredible. Think of places like South Korea, right? 2 generations ago, South Korea was in a very different place than it is now. Now I've got a Hyundai, right? They rule the world now, and it only took 2 generations. Okay, so you kind of want to say to the progressives, hey, look, right? Markets, look at how liberating markets can be when you've got enough wealth to pursue some of that self-actualization, all right? So that's a challenge that I might make there. On the other hand, conservatives, we might say, have been fairly suspicious of the idea of systemic injustice, right? Because they think of injustice as being between individuals, and that is sort of the normal way that we think about injustice. And they're saying, what is systemic injustice? That's too squishy of an idea. I don't know how to address injustice like that. You can't take it to a court, right? You can't take it to a judge. And so it looks like kind of a questionable concept. But what I'm going to try to say to conservatives, so I've got a message for progressives, I've got a message for conservatives. What I want to say to conservatives is, I can show you the existence of systemic injustice on your own assumptions, right? So what do conservatives love? They love the underlying institutions of markets, like private property and voluntary exchange, right? They love free markets. And I can show them that there have been forms of systemic injustice which involve exclusion from these institutions, okay? So in other words, I can prove it to them on their own assumptions. So I always say I've got, jumped there, sorry. I've got 2 theses, one for each of these. Conservatives tend to deny the existence of systemic oppression as too nebulous a concept. They also value the institutions that underlie the market economy, private property, and the rule of law. And I'm going to try to demonstrate that African American access to these institutions has been systemically denied, resulting in economic and cultural losses, at least historically speaking. While progressives tend to condemn the market economy as inherently oppressive, and I use just one example, African Americans, to demonstrate that it is exclusion from the markets that constitutes oppression, or from the institutions, market institutions, and instead of condemning open economies, I urge them to value economic freedom along with other kinds of freedom. So that's my thesis, okay? All right, so what's the first example of systemic oppression of African Americans? I'm going to start with the home, and there's, right, I could go further back than this, okay? I'm doing post-slavery history here, all right? And so I'm going to start with the Homestead Act. That's 1862, so we're still in the middle of the Civil War. It doesn't apply to African Americans till 1866 when they gain citizenship. The Homestead Act is 287 million acres of land that are handed out to people who are willing to homestead it. I think it was for 5 years, okay? So, people are moving west, right? They're picking up these parcels of land 160 acres each. So nice big farms. This is a huge basis for economic flourishing for anyone who's able to grab a hold of this opportunity, right? Well, here's what happened. Andrew Johnson returned plantations to whites even after the freedmen had already settled the land. Okay, so you had people who'd settled it and were farming it, and it was returned to whites. There was the Trumbull Bill, the 40 acres and a mule. Have you all heard of that bill? That every former slave should receive 40 acres, or slave household should receive 40 acres and a mule, vetoed by President Johnson. It actually passed, but it was vetoed. So no land ownership there to make amends for slavery. But you think, okay, but we've still got the Homestead Act, right? Okay, they can go and settle these acres and farm there. But a person named General Oliver Howard was put in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, and he decided that blacks weren't qualified enough to own their own farms, and so he turned it into a leasing system for them so that they could farm but not gain any equity. They weren't gaining ownership in the land the way that everybody else was. Okay, so no assets, right? You can survive off of the farming, but you can't gain the asset like whites could. At the same time, the Freedmen's Bank was set up for blacks to invest their funds. The all-white board of the Freedmen's Bank was corrupt. They decided to invest badly with that money. $31 million in savings was lost. Talk about trusting the banks, huh? I wonder about why blacks are underbanked. Well, there's a lot of distrust in banks. If you moved out west and a white person claimed ownership of your land, the judge would side with them. This is what we call the lack of the rule of law, right? The rule of law is that the owner is the owner, right? But if someone comes along to challenge, the whites were favored, okay? So there you have, out of 1.5 million homesteads that were handed out under the Homestead Act, only 5,500 were ever acquired by African American families. Very, very tiny percentage, many of whom, of course, had just been thrown out onto the open market after slavery. All right. Secondly, so that's my first example. My second example, this one's touchy, guys. All right, so we have to toughen up when we talk about some of this tough history. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I don't know if you're aware of this, but eugenics was very, very popular in America, right? The idea that we should sort of breed a master race or get rid of people who are deemed not good enough to continue reproducing. And it was very popular. I mean, it was actually just common among academics. Many economists were involved in this. They were on the board of eugenics organizations, and they were using economics and economic thought to figure out how to accomplish these goals. And one of the tools that they used was the minimum wage. Okay, now this is a little confusing because we don't think of the minimum wage this way now. But these were economists who knew that if you raise a wage high enough, certain people will not be hired at that higher wage. It may be because they're not as productive, they don't have as much education or as much human capital along with their labor, or it could be because of people's prejudice, right? I don't want to work with those people or something like that. Well, the owner might just make you do it if the person comes cheap enough. And it's a way to get people integrated into the workforce if you have an entry wage. But with a minimum wage pushed up high enough, you can exclude those people. And that was done explicitly. So I'm not just theorizing about this. The economists were totally explicit when they said this. And here's an example. This is Frank Taussig in his best-selling textbook, Principles of Economics in 1911. How to deal with the unemployable. Now, he didn't mean they were actually unemployable, right? They were the people he wanted to be unemployable. They should simply be stamped out, he stated. Quote, "We have not reached the stage where we can proceed to chloroform them once and for all, but at least they can be segregated, shut up in refuges and asylums, and prevented from propagating their kind. What are the possibilities of employing at the prescribed wages all the healthy, able-bodied who apply? The persons affected by such legislation would be those in the lowest economic and social group. The wages at which they can find employment depend on the prices at which their product will sell in the market, or in the technical language of modern economics, on the marginal utility of their services. All those whose additional product would so depress prices that the minimum could no longer be paid by employers would have to go without employment. It might be practicable to prevent employers from paying anyone less than the minimum, though the power of law must be very strong indeed and very rigidly exercised in order to prevent the making of bargains which are welcome to both bargainers." So here's an economist saying these people need to be stamped out. We're not allowed to just get rid of them. That's what he means by chloroform, right? We're not allowed to just kill them. Isn't that terrible to read? It's awful to even imagine that people talk this way, but they did. We can't just get rid of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to raise the wage so high that no one will hire them. And if no one will hire them, then they can just fade away, fade out from being unemployed. And this was not just African Americans, of course, but also some immigrant groups were excluded, and the disabled. And once again, I can give you 10 more quotes just as shocking as that one. Okay, so this is not, it's not theoretical. It was, they were very straightforward about their ideas at that time. All right, and so I'm going to come back to the issue of minimum wage here, because what I want to show you is that I think we actually have a little bit of a, I wish I'd made that bigger, sorry. We have a little bit of a backwards idea, I think, when it comes to minimum wages, because we don't necessarily think of the people who are being excluded from employment. One group is teenagers. And one reason that it's really important, particularly for poor teenagers, to get into the market then is because of the training that allows them to stay in the employment market as kids who aren't necessarily getting to college and things like that, right? And so you see here how black and white teen unemployment is very similar at first, but as the minimum wage increases, blacks become harder and harder to hire, okay? Oftentimes just because they're overrepresented under the poverty line. Maybe they don't have a car, right, or transportation or something like that. It makes it harder to hire, and if they're harder to hire, then they may not get on the employment ladder at all. All right, I have several more examples for you, but I know some of you need to leave for class at 1, and it's about that time, right? Okay, so do we want to take a quick pause if anybody needs to get up? Not bad, not too bad, just a few people. Okay, so just the people who need to go to class, and then I'll go to my next example. Okay, so while they're heading out, I'll just read you a couple of quotes from some economists who picked up on this destructive dynamic of the minimum wage. So here's Walter Williams. He's a black economist. He says, "It is important to note that most people acquire work skills by working at subnormal wages, which amounts to the same thing as paying to learn. For example, inexperienced doctors are interns, right? During their training, they work at wages almost nothing at all. College students often forego considerable wages in order to do an internship, right? We need to work for nothing sometimes." Okay, so what he's saying is working at a low wage or even at no wage is oftentimes just what you need to get to that next rung on the ladder, right? And it's actually quite valuable to people to do that. And so by raising that minimum wage, we pull that bottom rung off, and it becomes very hard for people to continue climbing. They can't get on at all. And Milton Friedman, a very famous public intellectual and economist, argued that the minimum wage was actually the most anti-black economic policy that he could think of, which was powerful. I don't know whether he's right about that, but that was his view. So that's something to think about as we consider minimum wages now. All right, let me just see what I've got next. So next I want to talk about housing. And I'm kind of moving historically. So we were just in the early 20th century with the progressive eugenics. Now we start seeing the rise of the possibility that blacks could be well off enough to start living in neighborhoods where white people live. And the Federal Housing Administration is subsidizing housing. It's insuring housing at low rates. And the Federal Housing Administration decided that areas that are pure racially are better, that that'll be more stable, okay, if we keep people separate, and also that blacks shouldn't be insured. And so the FHA, well, this is where we get the term redlining, right? The FHA drew lines around certain neighborhoods and they refused to insure in those neighborhoods. Here we have a picture of my own city, the city of St. Louis, I believe. Yeah. And you see the red areas are those that they wouldn't insure. And I want to do more research on this as time goes by. I'm hoping to write a book on this topic. And one of the things I want to look into is whether private banks would have been willing to give out these home loans. Because the fact of the matter is that blacks, all the way up until 1950s, had as high or higher employment rates than whites. They had very stable home lives, very low divorce rates, and very high literacy rates, up in the 70 percentile, even in like 1900, very early, okay? And so in terms of being reliable for loans, I don't see that they weren't. Now, the amounts of the loans might be smaller, right? A smaller home or something like that. But it seems to me that someone who's motivated by profit would think, hey, here's a bunch of people I could give loans to and have very reliable monthly payments. And so I'm interested to find that out. I have been told by one economist that a big leap forward for African Americans came with credit scores. So I'm going to look further into that as well, because credit scores, of course, don't see the color of your skin, right? It's just how reliable have you been in paying, and so you were able to see when people were being racist or unfair in handing out loans. But in this case, it was government policy, and that's my point, is that markets tend to push people towards integration because it makes more sense economically, right? Everybody's money is green, as the old saying goes. And so if it's going to cost more, then the state has to interpose and require the separation, right? So this was really social engineering. It was the FHA saying, let's make sure people live in different neighborhoods. Okay, let's not encourage mixing, because that'll be better. That'll be more stable, as though they knew what would be best. All right, next we have restrictive covenants. This is actually, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I live there now. And the great Supreme Court case that came out of the issue of restrictive covenants, happened in St. Louis. The house is still there. And the Presbyterian church that funded the case is right around the corner, still exists. And these were clauses that attached to property deeds. So people would put into their property deed that this house could never be sold to a fill in the blank, right? It was often African Americans, but also Chinese, right, and other groups were excluded in certain parts of the country. And what's weird about these covenants is that they bound all future owners, which is kind of a bizarre thing to be able to do, right? You might wonder whether that should hold up in court as a property right. Not only that I'm selling to who I want to sell to, but that I'm controlling how this is sold ever by any owner, right? That seems highly questionable, and it was questionable. The Supreme Court shot it down in the 1940s, and those are not legal. However, they're not legal anymore after I think it was 48. However, what's weird is you can't change those deeds. So the language is still there. Isn't that bizarre? You can't go back and take it out. So you can still go back and see the language. It's just not enforceable, which is wild. So, and these were all over St. Louis, by the way. This was, oh no, I'm sorry, it was 1968. So it was actually much later. I apologize. 1948 was the decision, and then there was the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Okay, and that was Shelley v. Kramer, which is the Shelleys were the family that moved into the St. Louis home and fought that court case. All right, there's a lot more I could say about housing. I've got to go quickly so that I don't take up too much time, but I can show you here, we can see how the area is divided, right? Blue is whites and green is blacks. This is St. Louis once again, so this is the Mississippi River, and you can see that it's extremely distinct, right? They're not overlaid. And in St. Louis, we talk about the Del Mar Divide because of Del Mar Boulevard, where you can look on one side and see the beautiful, expensive homes, and look on the other side and see just sheer poverty, all right? And so part of the point there, and think about this, guys. Think about the GI Bill, okay? The GI Bill allowed these soldiers coming home from war to go to college and to get housing, all right? And the FHA helped them build this housing very, very cheap. Now they're out. These are houses that are now very valuable out in the suburbs that have been handed down, right, through children and grandchildren. Black men who were soldiers in the war got the GI Bill, but there was nowhere for them to use it, right? The neighborhoods where they were allowed to live, they were not allowed to build, okay? So, and even in the case of college sometimes too, right? There was maybe no college that they were allowed to attend. So imagine that, coming home from the war, being handed this reward for all the danger that you undertook, but you are not able to gain that asset. And you know, there's houses now in Kirkwood, Missouri that are worth over $400,000 that were built with the GI Bill, right? And so those families, those black families, don't get those assets, okay, to be handed down. They weren't allowed to have them. All right, so that's yet another example. Okay, so let me do one more thing before I leave housing. I want to talk about eminent domain abuse. Have you guys heard of eminent domain abuse? Anyone? Do we know what eminent domain is? So this is a phrase from the Constitution, and the idea is that if there's some public good, you know, like a highway or something, and the government needs that land and you live on it, they have to compensate you, but they can take it. It gives them the right to take it, but only for public use is the term, public use, okay? Maybe a hospital, right? We think about what would you stretch to mean public use. And they have to give you a fair amount for it. Now, the first instance of abuse was the highway system, the federal highway system, which all these smart city planners who were deciding where the highway was going to go through town built it right through the black economic centers in every town, every major city in America. They took just the place where economic flourishing was beginning to occur, and they knocked it down and built a highway through it. Made sure that the white part of town and the black part of town were divided by the highway, okay, and took all that property. All right, so once again, the oppression there goes right to the property rights of people, okay, because that's where they decided to put the highway. That looked like a good idea to them. But then the term public use began to get stretched, where now, I'm sure you guys are aware, cities can actually decide to take your property and give it to Walmart, right? They can blight, Walmart's a private owner, right? That's not public use in any sense of the term we would recognize, but that's the decision that was made. This is the Kelo v. New London decision, very controversial decision. It actually caused a lot of upset at the time because people realized, wow, my property rights don't mean a whole lot. If Walmart can come in and just convince my city that they need my house, and there's nothing I have to say about it, right? So once again, what do your property rights mean? And talk about tribalism, guys. This is really interesting. I'm going to read you some statements by two justices on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor and Clarence Thomas. Okay, now if you know anything about Sandra Day O'Connor, you think of her as a more left-leaning judge. And if you know anything about Clarence Thomas, you think of him as a right-leaning judge. But they agreed in their dissent to Kelo v. New London. Why? I'll tell you. In their dissents, Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and Clarence Thomas not only pilloried the 5 justices in the majority for this expansion of so-called public use, but also predicted dire consequences as a result of the decision. Poor, minority, and other historically disenfranchised and comparably powerless communities would be disproportionately hurt through eminent domain abuse. Although it is well documented that urban renewal projects of the 1950s and 1960s targeted the poor and minorities, Some question whether such dynamics are true in contemporary redevelopment projects, as evidenced, for example, by the neighborhood at the center of the Kelo case. Okay? And this research uses census data to test the predictions of Justices O'Connor and Thomas, research that I include in my longer paper. It compares the demographic characteristics of 184 areas targeted. They are far more likely to be populated by poor and ethnic minorities and those with lower levels of educational attainment. Because if I'm going to knock down a neighborhood, right, I'm not going to knock down my friend's neighborhood. Okay? I'm going to knock down a neighborhood that doesn't look very good to me. Right? And their property rights don't matter as much. That's a failure of the rule of law. That's what that is. So I think it's interesting that you saw a left judge and a right judge come together on that decision. And really for many of the same reasons. Okay? And I could say more, but I'll stop with that one on the property rights, housing, and highways. All right? Next, I want to talk about Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. As you can see, we're kind of moving through in time. The highways were built in the 1950s. Now we're in 1964. I wish that I had a chart that showed you even a little further back, because what you'll see is that poverty is falling precipitously at this time. This is an economic boom time, and people are getting richer anyway. But LBJ decided that it was very important to fight a war on poverty, and as soon as he did, the fall in poverty leveled off. Okay, and so there's actually a quote from him saying, if we don't do something by 1980, there will be 13% poverty. And in 1980, there was 13% poverty. Okay, so it made no difference. So there's a couple of things I want to say about this. Of course, blacks are overrepresented under the poverty line, so this is going to have a disparate impact on them. However, we are now seeing intense impacts on poor rural whites that look exactly the same. Okay, so these sorts of policies have the same impacts no matter what color you are. It's just that the people who were targeted first by them were primarily black. All right, and so there's a couple of things we see. Number one, I'm not sure if you guys are aware of the term perverse incentive. Have any of you taken economics, maybe? So we know what incentives are, right? If we're incentivized, we're motivated. So perverse incentive is something where you're given an incentive to do the opposite of what really we should want you to be doing, right? It's a perverse incentive. It's sometimes called a moral hazard because it's going to push people in the wrong direction. One thing about the way that we've set up the Great Society is that we have made payments. We've made one of the requirements for payments be singleness, right? That you not be married. So a mother with children cannot have a father in the household and receive those payments. And what that does is it disincentivizes marriage. Now, if you've done any studies on poverty, this isn't really controversial at all. You know that you're much more likely to be impoverished if you come from a single family home. And really, if you think about it, of course you are, right? Because you only have one income coming in, and it's a lot harder, and mom's trying to juggle everything, or dad, right? We have single dads sometimes too, trying to juggle it all and grab a babysitter where they can, and it's very stressful, okay? And so of course it's going to be harder in a single family household. And what we see sadly, and this is really heartbreaking to me, is we see the rise in single parent families absolutely skyrocket to the point now where among the African American community, 37% of black children are born in an intact family, right? That's what is that, 63%, right? From single parent. Okay, so that's much more unstable, much more difficult economically, for sure. But it's a disincentive that was offered through the Great Society. And as I said before, marriage rates were very high in the black community, and divorce rates were extremely low, lower than whites in the 1950s, which indicates to me that the two things are highly correlated. Okay, now I'm not saying you can't argue with that. You could say, well, maybe there was this factor or that factor. We could talk about that. But boy, they sure line up well in terms of time. Okay, so that's one issue with the Great Society. And the next is just the sheer inefficiency of this system. For instance, so we spend about $1 trillion a year fighting poverty. In fact, if we did everything the federal government spends and everything that the local governments spend, it would be $20,000 for every poor person. So imagine if you just handed every poor person $20,000. If you had a family of 4, that'd be $80,000 income for that household, right? I mean, you could almost solve poverty just by doing a direct cash payment. But instead, and this is actually predicted by economists and game theorists, what ends up happening is that middle-class bureaucrats make sure that they get paid, right? There's a lot of people who want to get paid through the system. They make sure that they get paid, and the actual amount that goes to people who are genuinely in need is very low, all right? And it's not, I'm sure, have you guys ever heard the phrase welfare cliff? So the welfare cliff is a situation in which if you do just a little bit better, you lose all your benefits. So it makes it, once again, it's a perverse incentive or a moral hazard, makes it very difficult to get up and out. So you can survive based on your welfare payments, but you're not going to escape poverty, because when you get that job and then you make 5 cents more, you lose all your TAMF or SNAP, whatever it might be, benefits, and that's not economically rational. To do that, you've got kids at home, right? I remember one lady saying that she got a Pell Grant to go to college, and so they took away her benefits. And she said, what are my kids supposed to eat? The textbooks? Right? And so here she is trying to better herself so she can go out and be independent financially, but the system is forcing her to remain dependent, right? And it's taking all that initiative and just squashing it. That's a perverse incentive. It's very destructive. And we've seen the outcome. Unemployment rates skyrocketed, okay, under this system. It's perverse. I already said that. All right. So there's a lot more we could say about the Great Society, but I think just those 2 factors right there are really, really shocking to consider. There's the family breakdown numbers for you, and you can see how quickly those single-parent families climbed, which is going to make the economic situation a lot tougher. Okay. Finally, I want to talk about the mass incarceration crisis. This is really the issue that got me into this whole research project. I'm very interested in criminal justice reform. And as you can see, we have a really strange situation here where ever since the mid-70s, our incarceration rates have been climbing exponentially. Now, there have been some rises in crime as well. So you might say, well, maybe the incarceration rate grew because the crime grew. But here's the strange thing, and I think I have this in here somewhere. Hold on. Yeah, there it is. Here's the strange thing. Look at this. Yes, you did have a rise in certain forms of crime. You see that for a period. But then what happens? The incarceration rate, which is the green line, keeps going up even as the crime goes down, right? So now we actually have levels of crime that are very similar to 1970, back when the imprisonment rates were very low, but our imprisonment rates are through the roof. And this is another example of being able to fight tribalism, because we've actually seen a huge amount of cooperation between the left and the right on criminal justice reform. Republicans and Democrats getting together. Trump, for instance, just passed the First Step Act. Okay, now the federal system is actually not that relevant. It's the state system where most people are imprisoned. And so that's where you really need to make more progress. But still, it was meaningful that some of that was done at the federal level as well. One of the states that's made the most progress on CJ reform is Texas, right? Which you think of as quite conservative, okay? And it's been conservative groups that have gotten together on this, partially because it's very costly, okay? But also because of, if you've ever heard of prison fellowship, it's an evangelical movement that was started by Chuck Colson, right? Nixon's right-hand man who went to prison and had a religious experience. And he got white evangelicals to become aware of what was going on in prisons. And so there's more sensitivity there, frankly, because of him. And so you're seeing some movement on this, but it really is a crisis. We can't afford it. It has all sorts of terrible effects on communities. Fathers gone for years and years, not being able to be employed when you come back out, sentences getting longer and longer, aggressive prosecution, charge stacking, all sorts of stuff that needs to be addressed. Much of it, frankly, at the level of prosecution, okay? And so we spend, $80 billion a year on our criminal justice system, and we do see a disparate impact on blacks. Now, is that because people are consciously racist? Maybe, maybe not. But I'll say they don't have to be, because a lot of this can also progress by class, as a matter of class, right? So if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of money and you can't get your own lawyer, then you're much more likely to give in when a prosecutor tries to scare you with a bunch of charges and says that there's a minimum sentence for each of these, and you might have to go to jail for 80 years and things like that, right? And so people are much more likely to plead guilty to things they didn't even do, and many of those things because of aggressive prosecution if you're poor. If you're not, and you can afford a lawyer, then you do much better. And that could be the reason there's a disparate impact, right? It's hard to separate out sometimes all of the different causes. Okay, and so what we finally see here then, and this is just where we see some of the disparate impact between blacks and whites, and also the way that prison sentences are getting longer and longer. And it's really breaking state budgets. It really is. Like, it's a problem. Overcrowding in prisons, not enough money for these prisons. Okay, so what we see finally is that black income is going up, right? And the black middle class is growing. It's catching up in terms of the white middle class. A ton of entrepreneurialism in the black community, really great progress. But when you look at the assets, they remain very low, okay? Now, I'm not saying that all of that is explained by this historic injustice. It may not be, right? There may be different spending habits and saving habits, and that should be discussed too. But the fact of the matter is that some of it is definitely explained by the fact that assets were not able to be accumulated by black Americans the way that they were by white Americans, because assets, that's your wealth, right? That's what you've got in your house or in your stocks, and right, your IRA, that kind of stuff. Okay, that's your wealth, not your yearly income, but your wealth. And that's what has remained fairly stagnant in the black community, which I think can at least be partially explained by the story I'm telling you today. And so that's the sort of case that I'm trying to make to conservatives. Hey, you want people to save, you want people to buy a house, you want people to work hard, right? You want people to stay married. That's all things that conservatives want. Look at the history. Look what we've done. Look how each of those things that I mentioned was undermined by the law. I mean, what's systemic? What's more systemic than the law, right? So if there's a law in place that is disincentivizing certain kinds of behaviors or just making it completely impossible, then that's systemic injustice. Okay, I recommend a few books here. The Color of Law, which is the whole story of redlining by the FHA, by Rothstein. Illiberal Reformers by Thomas Leonard is the book about progressive eugenics. He talks about a lot of things, the history of economics, but specifically deals with the eugenics movement among economists and many other academics. And then Losing Ground is a book that deals specifically with the kinds of perverse incentives that I mentioned with LBJ's Great Society. So to return to my overarching theme about tribalism and personal brand, you see here what's happening. Do we all feel it on our social media accounts? Can we feel it? The polarization, the hatred, right? The tribalism. Okay, nobody wants to talk to anybody. They don't want to hear the other side out. You see people getting further apart there. All right? And so it's an interesting thought to ask ourselves whether, your personal brand will never appeal to everyone. And when I talk about trying to get people on both sides of the aisle to talk to one another, I don't mean you're going to make friends with everybody. As a matter of fact, some people are going to be very angry with you that you're talking to the other side at all, right? They're going to be angry about that. But there's a big exhausted middle who's exhausted by all the anger. And they're actually going to want to hear what you have to say. Okay, so one thought about your personal brand is to be a peacemaker, right? To be someone who's willing to see what's right on the other side. You can still see what's wrong on the other side, but you're willing to see what's right, and you're willing to work together with people. Okay, and I can give you a couple of examples. I brought in Ralph Nader, far, far left guy, and Grover Norquist, far right, anti-tax, Republican type. and I brought them in together. They're on the same side against cronyism, crony capitalism, businesses getting favors from the government in order to shut out competitors. Ralph Nader doesn't like it. Grover Norquist doesn't like it, right? And you should have seen the two groups come in, buttoned up Republicans and wilted hippies. And they all came in, they looked at each other like, who are you? Why are we at the same event? But that's good, right? They're coming together to show we actually agree on something. And Ralph Nader actually kind of inspired me. He said, you know what? If you agree on a certain policy, even if you agree with it for different reasons, you are morally required to work with the other side to make that happen. That really hit me. It really did. Criminal justice reform. Cory Booker, a Democrat, Rand Paul, a Republican, working together to pass criminal justice reform legislation, and similar things like that are happening in every state. Okay? Lots of talk about that. How about occupational licensing? This is another case of loss of economic freedom as a form of systemic injustice. It's one thing to ask your doctor to be licensed. It's another thing to say that you have to be licensed to braid somebody's hair or hair dry it or build a coffin, right? Or put together a bouquet of flowers. You add licensing onto that, you shut a lot of people out. Why do you have to have a high school diploma to be a barber? You don't. You don't. That's not fair, right? That shuts people out. And so many more businesses were adding licensing requirements because the established businesses didn't want those startups to cut into their profits. They didn't want competition. They wanted to shut out the competition. In Missouri, we just passed the African Hair Braiding Act, so that those African hair braiders who do nothing but braid hair, there's no chemicals involved, didn't have to go to 2 years of cosmetology school to do their job, right? Because all those salons wanted was a cut of the profit. That's all that was, okay? And so, can you believe it? Charles Koch and Barack Obama. Talk about unusual partners, right? Charles Koch, a flaming libertarian, and Barack Obama, Democratic president, okay? So this can happen. We can walk away from the tribalism. I truly believe that. And we can see what's right with the other side. We can acknowledge what's true, okay? And we can work together to deal with some of these injustices. And I hope that one thing you take away from today is that economic freedom is just as important as your other freedoms, right? Your right to your property, your right to contract for labor, etc. Okay? Thank you very much. Sure.
Just raise your hand and...
I'm not going to promise that I know the answer to your question, but yeah.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Ferguson. This is
You're welcome.
really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about what you feel like the current state of affairs would be for Black entrepreneurship now in America?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, what a great question. So here's the funny thing. I actually think from my own, I mean, this is, what do I want to say? It's anecdotal, right? It's my own experience. But from my own experience, the Black community that I'm involved with is highly entrepreneurial. There's a ton of interest in being in the business world, owning businesses. Lindenwood just brought in Clifton Talbert, who wrote the book Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored. He now owns the only all African-American owned coffee company. By the way, it's the best coffee I've ever had in my life. It's called Roots Java. Just get online now and order some, okay? It's so good. And he came and talked to the students about having an entrepreneurial mindset. When I bring in speakers to talk about Black entrepreneurship, and like say the Black Student Union comes, every kid is up front saying, I want to run a business. I have an idea. I have a business idea. So I think that what is true of some progressives, a kind of anti-market standpoint, doesn't actually match up that well with your regular, everyday African-American person, okay? And so I'm very hopeful about it, but we have to understand what things like occupational licensing and other forms of nitpicky regulation, let's call it that. Nitpicky regulation, if you're coming up from a tougher background, not as much capital, right, whatever it might be, you cannot deal with another 10 things that you're required to do, a million hoops to jump through, a bunch of paperwork for the government. All of that is slowing you down. It's slowing you down majorly. And I don't think that's always appreciated by people, because if you look at one regulation by itself, it kind of looks like it makes sense. You're like, well, why not? Let's put it'll be a little safer, whatever it might be. But you stack those up and it becomes totally overwhelming for new entrepreneurs. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm really hoping that this, anti-occupational licensing kind of stuff, and like the Institute for Justice is a great organization if you want to check them out, who fights for people's property rights. They're not getting ticketed to death. They're not, those sorts of things that are just making it hard for anyone to get things off the ground. One more point, when it's kind of the tie-in with the mass incarceration issue, we all know that there's an issue with re-entering citizens getting jobs, right? And we talk about ban the box. Here's the problem, and I hate to say this, I really do, but when you legally ban the box, guess what people do? They take every black name. I mean, if it says Jamal, right? They take every one and they put it in the trash because they assume that they're a part of the criminal justice system. They assume it. So the only way to get that going in terms of getting re-entering citizens hired, I believe, is to get companies to intentionally ban the box. In other words, and this is what the Coke Industries has done actually, because Charles Koch is really into this. What they've done is they've prepared everyone, they prepared managers that we are trying to help give re-entering citizens another chance. And so yes, we're gonna find out that they have a charge, but not until the end of the interview process. And we're prepared for some of the extra challenges. It sucks to have to go to your probation officer at 11 a.m. in the morning when you have a real job, right? But it helps a lot if your manager is intentionally trying to get you on board. And so I think the movement, and this is happening, there's a movement of companies. You can actually go online and find the list. Dots Food is one of them. Coke Industries, Dots Food, and some others who are intentionally trying to undertake that sort of project. So I think there's a lot of wonderful things happening and percolating, but there's also the pushback, and the hard thing for me is that it's so easy to miss, right? It's like I said with the regulation. It's so easy to think, sure, whatever, that's fine, and not realize that's just one more layer that you're adding on top that's making it hard. It's not harder for the middle class person who has a college degree to do all this stuff and wait a year to start their business, right? I mean, it might be harder for them too, but it's not as hard, right, as it is for somebody who's, hey, I could do a lawn business, or I could get something going here and be supporting my family. That's the person who it's gonna stop from ever getting the ball rolling at all, right? I wish we could get that message out so that we can fight those sorts of petty regulations. Yeah, that would be my take. Great question. Anybody else? Yeah, Isaiah?
So this is not really I guess that much of a simple question, but I remember hearing about the tax and how they would divide the tax. It would be like tax and whatever in the old days, for property and all that stuff. And I think that played a part, but I don't know where I'm getting to, but do you believe that plays a part too?
Differences in taxation?
Yeah.
I'm not an economist, I'm a philosopher. So I will look into that because I'm not aware of what the differences in taxation were. I do know this, which is that certain sorts of taxes are more regressive, than others. And the term regressive, just to explain this, just means that's gonna be harder on the poor. So, and we actually have a fairly progressive tax system, actually. I mean, rich people pay a lot of money in taxes, even compared to a lot of other countries. But sales tax, for instance, is going to be harder on the poor, right? Because they're spending a lot of their income on, food, right? Stuff that you just need to survive. So it is interesting to think about, okay, which ways do we want to set things up to make it easier for people to get ahead? But that's a great question, and I just need to look into that myself, the history of taxation. Yeah. Anybody else?
Maybe last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
As far as personal brand, you talked about political ideology, do you think this drastic divide between people will eventually lead to an explosive discourse, or do you think it will lead people to come back together and share common ideas?
It's anybody's guess. Let me think about that. What do I think will happen? I mean, we don't know, and okay, so let's put it this way. So there's a lot of discussion about this, right? Why is our civil discourse so contemptuous, right? This is a question everybody's kind of puzzling over. Is it social media, right? I don't see you. You're not face to face with me. You're just on a screen, so I can be super contemptuous. Is it people feeling ignored by politicians, right? Is it people that are in too much of a bubble? You know, so you've never met anybody that wasn't like you. And so you just have terrible stereotypes of them and you don't really have any experience with them. You know, let's say that it's, any of those things. Social media, bubbles, they're not getting better. You know, I mean, there's good evidence. So Charles Murray, who wrote the book Losing Ground, just wrote a book called Coming Apart. And in that book, he talks about specifically white America. And he's talking specifically about the way that you sort of have elites and sort of poor, poor rural white America. And that these two groups do not speak, that they're becoming more and more separate. They're not marrying each other. That some people are meeting at college and they're marrying each other, and then other people are meeting at work and they're marrying each other, and they're no longer in the same families, they're not in the same crowds, okay? And so they do not understand each other. One part feels oppressed by the other. And so I can't say to you what source of hope I have for things to get a whole lot better in terms of our civil discourse, except just some sort of cultural demand for it. And there's some demand for it, for sure. So I'll give you two examples. There's a group called Heterodox Academy, if you're interested in this sort of thing. So Heterodox Academy is run by a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, and he's trying to get people to commit to viewpoint diversity. All right, so he's trying to show people that they're making mistakes because they're not hearing any critiques. They're only in their own bubble. And so they're making even intellectual mistakes, right? And so he's trying to get the academy to commit to that. So that's a movement, all right, for coming together. And another one is a book that is coming out or is out right now, and that is the book by Arthur Brooks. It's called Love Your Enemies, something or other, How We Can Deal with the Culture of Contempt. And you can actually go on YouTube and watch him talk for 5 minutes, about the culture of contempt and what he thinks the solution is. But I think it's really a problem. It's dangerous, and I can't give you great news. I mean, I think either we purposefully turn this around or it's going to go down the toilet. I really do think so, because it's very bad. In my opinion, I think we're in very bad shape in terms of our civil discourse. It's a great question and a very difficult one. All right, thanks everybody.